everyone to be here this morning for this important press conference with the Human Rights Watch for the presentation of the World Report 2024. So without further ado, I leave the floor to our moderator, UN Director of Human Rights Watch, Charbonneau. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you to all the panelists for being here today.
Thanks, Valeria, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the launch of Human Rights Watch World Report 2024. I would like to give a special thanks to our friends and longtime partners, the UN Correspondents Association. Thanks again, Valeria. It's an honor to be back in this room for this event. We last launched our World Report in this very room in 2020. So it's exciting to be back here. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our executive director in the middle, Tirana Hassan, will present the report. To my right is our deputy director for Europe and Central Asia, Rachel Denber. Then to Tirana's right is our deputy Africa director, Carine Nantulya. And then on the right is our Middle East and North Africa director, Lama Fakih. There are also other Human Rights Watch experts in the room. So when the press conference is over, feel free to reach out and talk to us. And then during the press conference, if there are any issues that we want to bring in people from the floor, we will. We will be taking questions from the room, but also from Zoom. There are many people out there following live, and a big hello to all of you out there in the rest of the world. So without further ado, I hand it over to Tirana.
Thanks very much, Lou, and good morning, everyone in the room, and good afternoon and good evening for folks online. Thanks for joining us for our 2024 World Report launch. My name, as Lou mentioned, is Tirana Hassan, and I'm the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. So first, I want to begin with what 2023 showed us, that the system we rely on to protect the human rights of people everywhere is under threat. Every time a government overlooks or rejects the universal and globally accepted laws and principles, someone pays a price in freedoms, in liberties, in their health or livelihoods, and at times with their lives. The threats to our common humanity are everywhere. We see it in Israel and Palestine, where renewed hostilities following the October 7th attacks in Israel intensified a human rights and humanitarian crisis. The atrocities of Hamas-led fighters, including the deliberate killing of hundreds of civilians and the taking of more than 200 people hostage, was a terrifying assault. Many governments quickly and justifiably condemned the unlawful killings and hostage-taking by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. But following the attacks, the Israeli government sealed the crossings into Gaza and unlawfully blocked the entrance of food, fuel, and humanitarian aid to Gaza's 2.3 million population. Israeli bombardments have killed thousands of civilians, including thousands of children, and reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. And it's displaced the majority of Gaza's population. Yet, many governments that condemned Hamas's war crimes have been muted in responding to the war crimes committed by the Israeli government. The US has repeatedly vetoed UN Security Council resolutions that called on Israel and Palestinian armed groups to comply with international humanitarian law and protect civilians. Last month, it only allowed a weak and diluted resolution to pass. This reluctance is consistent with the refusal by the United States and many European member countries to urge an end to the Israeli government's 16-year unlawful closure of Gaza and to denounce its ongoing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. Selective outrage about grave abuses sends a dangerous message that some people's lives and dignity matter more than others. And this shakes the legitimacy of the systems of rules that we rely on to protect everyone's rights. But there are also strong examples of leadership to address the crisis. Last month, South Africa asked the International Court of Justice to determine whether Israel violated its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention in its military operations in Gaza. And today, the ICJ judges in The Hague are hearing arguments to determine whether to grant South Africa's request for provisional measures directing Israel to cease acts that could violate the Genocide Convention. And obviously, Israel will appear before the court tomorrow. This international scrutiny by an independent, impartial body is welcome. But such scrutiny is sorely lacked in situations such as Sudan, where people are suffering because of the absence of global leadership to address widespread abuses in the country's conflict. In April 2023, an armed conflict broke out in Sudan when the armed forces chief and the leader of the Rapid Support Forces began battling each other for power. The fighting that resulted has led to massive abuses against civilians, notably in Darfur. And it is eerily reminiscent of those committed over the past 2 decades by forces loyal to both generals. Now, instead of ramping up its scrutiny of abuses in Sudan, the UN Security Council closed its political mission there at the insistence of the Sudanese government. And what little remained of the UN's capacity to protect civilians and publicly report on the rights situation has largely ended. South Africa's leadership to address the human rights crisis in Palestine shows us what is possible when governments step up to protect civilians. The challenge and the urgency is for all governments to apply the human rights framework consistently in a principled manner, no matter who the perpetrator or the victim. Another threat to the human rights system is when governments completely ignore human rights obligations in favor of short-term, politically expedient solutions. Now, they do this to prioritize things like security, energy, and migration. And we have seen this type of transactional diplomacy play out with US allies like Saudi Arabia, India, and Egypt, where they have violated the rights of their people on a massive scale, yet have deepened their ties with the United States. The leaders of Vietnam, the Philippines, and India, and other nations the US wants as counterweights to China have been fettered at the White House despite horrendous human rights records at home. And we see it in the European Union's efforts to circumvent its human rights obligations to asylum seekers and migrants, especially those from Africa and the Middle East, striking deals with abusive governments like Libya, Turkey, and Tunisia to keep migrants out of the European bloc. Ignoring human rights and the rule of law in diplomacy squanders opportunities to influence the practices and policies of rights-violating governments. And it also risks emboldening these repressive governments to export their abuses. And we saw this in 2023. The governments of India, China, and Rwanda targeting their critics living in other countries, essentially doing their dirty work on foreign soil. Now, for instance, China's government has issued baseless arrest warrants and bounties on 8 Hong Kong democracy activists and former legislators in exile. The takeaway is sobering. If repressive governments can get away with heavy-handed tactics to silence critics beyond their borders, then nowhere is safe. Across Regions 2023 also demystified the handbook that autocrats use to consolidate power so that they can essentially act without scrutiny. Whether it's Tunisian President Kais Saied, who has steadily weakened the judiciary, cracked down on political opponents and perceived critics, and targeted freedom of expression and the press, or in Thailand, where the politically compromised Constitutional Court suspended from Parliament the leading candidate for Prime Minister on bogus charges. Or in El Salvador, where President Nayib Bukele is using the security narrative to justify mass detention of mostly low-income people. And technology has made it even easier to silence critics and censor dissent. And it is a stark reminder of the pressing need for comprehensive, rights-respecting regulation of the global public square. So why do politicians work so hard to attack independent institutions and civil society? Well, it's because they hold those in power to account and they can deliver victories for people's rights. And we saw numerous examples of that in 2023 as well. For example, after years of civil society pressure, the parliament in Japan passed its first law to protect LGBT people from unfair discrimination. And in Nepal, where the Supreme Court instructed authorities to recognize same-sex marriage while it considers a case demanding full marriage equality. And in Mexico, where a civil society coalition persuaded Congress to pass and establish a law establishing full legal capacity and the rights to supported decision-making for everyone over 18, which benefits millions of people living with disabilities and older people. The UK's highest court unanimously found that Rwanda, because of its poor human rights record, is not a safe third country for governments to send asylum seekers. The UK government has since introduced a bill to Parliament to get around the court's ruling, but the UK cannot legislate its way out of the reality that Rwanda counters criticism with violence and abuse. And the United Nations has a role to play here too. And it's not just the Security Council, which is so often deadlocked due to disagreements and obstruction amongst the 5 permanent members. The UN Security Council, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has strongly condemned Hamas atrocities, Israel's illegal collective punishment against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and the tragic deaths of dozens of UN staff who have been risking their lives to bring aid to Palestinians in need. He's condemned Russian atrocities in Ukraine, but has been reluctant to criticize the Chinese government's crimes against humanity, against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. No government, no matter how powerful, should get a free pass. The UN General Assembly has sometimes stepped in to where the Security Council has failed to act, such as on Ukraine and Israel-Palestine. So has the Human Rights Council, and UN member states need to continue to look for ways to work around the Security Council when it is paralyzed and is making decisions that are harmful to human rights. We do have a roadmap to build thriving, inclusive, peaceful societies. They're the universal principles of international law and the rule of law. The human rights framework emerged from one of the darkest times in human history. It was agreed on by all states from regions crossing all of the world. But let's be clear, realizing human rights depends on the decisions, policies, and practices of governments to bring them to life. And governments should respect, protect, and defend human rights with the urgency, vigor, and persistence needed to confront and address the global challenges that threaten our common humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the issues that has been quite prominent on the UN's agenda for almost 10 years now has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, initially in 2014, and also today with the full-scale invasion soon entering its 3rd year. And it has exacted a crushing toll on civilians, killing more than 10,000 since 2022. And this was before Russia launched a new wave of missile and drone attacks starting in December, just last month, that hit cities across Ukraine. Well, throughout the year, Russian forces committed war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine. I'll just break them down into two categories. First, they carried out indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks that killed and severely injured civilians, destroyed schools, hospitals, energy infrastructure, and the like. And as you know, Russia is occupying several parts of several regions of Ukraine in the east and the southeast, and also Crimea. And in these areas, Russian forces' use of torture against detained civilians has been widespread and systematic. Also in these areas, Russian forces are seeking to erase Ukrainian identity by forcing parents to have their children study in the Russian state education curriculum in the Russian language. Finally, Russia is also conscripting Ukrainian citizens in occupied areas into the Russian military and exerting other pressure to get them to fight in the war on the Russian side against their fellow Ukrainian citizens. Now, these are all patterns that we saw in 22 and also in 2023. But there were also singular events in 2023 that I'd like to just flag. One was the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, so a dam, reportedly by Russian forces, and it devastated livelihoods and caused lasting environmental damage in Ukraine. And then also the other thing is the Russian forces have been repeatedly shelling vital ports and grain facilities in Ukraine, with serious implications, obviously, for Ukrainians, but also for worldwide food prices. There were also positive landmark developments regarding Ukraine. One was the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for President Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner for the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. This is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's needed for justice, but it is a very crucial first step. But meanwhile, the Kremlin has also taken an arsenal of measures for the second year in a row to completely crush any vestige of dissent about the war in Ukraine or otherwise about Russian government policies, and more generally to crush independent civic activism. Now, Tirana, I have to agree with you that that Ukraine provides a good example of how the UN system can step into action when there is a deadlock in the Security Council. I would just flag the UN's, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, their excellent work that they've been doing in Ukraine for the past, basically since 2014, with just a trove of reliable reporting on human rights violations. And also the UN Commission of Inquiry that's been in place for almost 2 years now, that's been documenting patterns of violations as well. And also just the UN Human Rights Council has now renewed the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Russia, who is documenting the massive crackdown on dissent in the wake of the full-scale invasion, and also serving as a focal point for Russia's civil society within the UN system, what's remained of Russia's civil society. So these are all important measures, and they need to be supported in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Carine.
Thanks, you. Thanks, everyone. South Africa's contribution in addressing the human rights crisis in Gaza shows what is possible when governments unequivocally decide that civilian lives should be put front and center in diplomacy, negotiations, and in times of war. As Tirana rightfully said, the challenge and the urgency is for all governments to apply the human rights framework consistently and in a principled manner, no matter who's the perpetrator or the victim. Today, we need to see global leadership leveraged upon Sudan, Ethiopia, the Sahel, and Eastern Congo, where armed conflicts have killed thousands of civilians in 2023 and forced millions from their homes. Today, we see global crises unfolding side by side, with forgotten conflicts like the continuing humanitarian disasters and crises in Cameroon or Somalia. 2023 was a difficult year in Africa. We saw a recrudescence of military coups and juntas increasingly cracking down on the media, the opposition, and narrowing the civic space. We saw similar crackdown on civil and political rights in the context of elections in Zimbabwe and recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2024, so this year, Africa will hold at least 14 presidential elections, including in Senegal, South Africa, Rwanda, Chad, and South Sudan. And these will be consequential as African leaders will be called upon to ensure, once again, the credibility of elections and avert potential instability. Finally, representatives of the African Union, who are commonly referred as the A3, and who are members of the UN Security Council, should use their leverage, their leadership, to put pressure on the Security Council to demand that those responsible for atrocities and serious crimes are held accountable. We know that this is possible. This would not only resonate with their international obligations, but also with the African Union's founding principles, which prioritize the promotion of democratic principles, popular participation, and the protection of human and people's rights. Thank you.
Lama.
Thank you. In 2023, we documented alarming human rights trends in the Mena region that, if unchecked, will sink the region into further instability, with global ramifications. These include the crackdown on civil society and the erosion of independent institutions, the failure to develop economic policies that protect economic rights, the unwillingness to commit to policies that are responsive to climate change, systemic and entrenched discrimination, and finally, the persistent failure to protect civilians caught up in armed conflicts. This failure is a collective one. It is a failure of the warring parties, their allies, and of the multilateral institutions that we look to defend human rights and civilians caught up in war. 7 countries in the region experienced active armed conflict in 2023, conflicts that regional and global powers were also at times parties to. To say we are a region embroiled in conflict fails to capture it. We are bleeding out because of it. The conflicts are marked by impunity and a disregard for civilian protection. Prohibited weapons have been used. Civilians, including journalists and humanitarian workers, and even children and asylum seekers have been targeted. While civilian objects like hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure like water and electricity have been damaged and destroyed. Civilians have had their freedom of movement restricted. They have been forcibly displaced. They have been denied the means of survival, from water and food to humanitarian and medical assistance. The unexploded ordnance that is the legacy of years of conflict continues to kill. With some important exceptions, warring parties have largely been immune to accountability. And yet we know peace is elusive without justice. As we look ahead, and from the seat of the UN here in New York, our message is clear. The universal principles of international human rights law are the roadmap to building thriving, peaceful, and inclusive societies. But governments need to choose to step up to follow them, to prioritize them, to enforce them. There will be some early tests in 2024. Will Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria experience any consequences if they fail to allow free and fair elections? Will states support the International Court of Justice proceedings around genocide in Gaza, which began today in The Hague, and publicly commit to supporting compliance with the court's decisions? Will the UN act to enforce any provisional measures ordered by the court? It can take courage to act in defense of human rights, but the alternative is to brave the trajectory of selective or non-compliance with these principles. And if we've learned anything from 2023, it is just how devastating that trajectory is. Thank you.
Thanks, Lama. Let's go to questions now. And just a reminder to please introduce yourself and the media you represent. And the same reminder to those on Zoom. Also put your questions in the Q&A box and make sure to include your name and media affiliation. So we'll start with James, then Edie.
Tirana, question for you if I can, and it's on today's events in The Hague. So first, just to be clear, what is Human Rights Watch's view of South Africa's case that they made this morning, number one? And number two, if the court decides on provisional measures, what then are the obligations of the various parties here, particularly here at the UN and Security Council members, and particularly perhaps the US? You know, what position would we have if President Biden, for example, decided for another veto this time in defiance of the world's highest court, given he keeps talking about a rules-based international order?
Great. Thanks, James. So look, the crime of genocide is a very high threshold to prove, because you need to prove the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And that's actually why the ICJ case is so important. South Africa is essentially asking the court to determine if Israel's military operations in Gaza have resulted in violations of the 1948 Genocide Convention, and if they've failed to prevent genocide. And the situation on the ground is so grave that it does merit the court's scrutiny. And Human Rights Watch welcomes this case. We support that, and we think that other countries and other states, including the United States, should support and ensure that Israel complies with the court's decisions. Look, I think one of the things about compliance, South Africa and Israel are legally bound by what decisions the court takes. And the fact that Israel is actively participating in these proceedings is a sign that Israel itself is bound by the court's orders and judgments, and it believes in the legitimacy of the court. So any flouting of the court's decisions and the court's orders would leave a very dark stain on its reputation. And I think, yes, of course, if there is a decision that comes down from the International Court of Justice, the next step is that it would go to the UN Security Council. But there are many other steps that can be taken, and states and UN member states can exercise their support for the decisions of the court by using political statements, sanctions, and arms embargoes, just as an example.
Edie?
Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I had the same question as James, but I have another question. Tirana, looking back at human rights violations in, let's say, since 2000, how serious would you rate the situation in 2023 going into 2024? And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you have any expectations for what the situation might be this year? And aside from Gaza and Ukraine, what other hotspots should we all be watching?
Of course. Thanks for the question, Edie. I mean, let's just start with the latter part of your question for a minute, because, armed conflicts have mushroomed across the world, but they didn't come out of nowhere. The armed conflicts that we are seeing, and yes, of course, Israel and Palestine are top of the agenda right now. The war in Ukraine, there are wars continuing in Myanmar, there is conflict in Ethiopia, and of course, the one that is not making the headlines is the conflict in Sudan and the immense human suffering that is happening in Darfur. And let's just take Darfur for a minute. because it is actually one of the most illustrative cases about what 2024 could hold if we don't see governments starting to take accountability more seriously. What we are seeing unfolding in Sudan right now, in Darfur, is not a surprise. It is a product of decisions that were taken over a decade ago, when member states of the UN, with the European states making up the European Union, the United States, all chose to give the abusers of the human rights violations that happened in Darfur and the genocide a free pass. There was a push to move to peace in Sudan, and it was said that there would be no peace without there would be no just peace without if we were to go to pursue justice. And what we've seen is the exact opposite of that. We have seen, because there was no justice, it has simply emboldened the perpetrators from the previous conflict to continue and do what they're doing now. So I think that it's not only about the conflicts that are emerging, it's how governments in 2024 respond to these conflicts. And it needs to be an end to the double standards that we're talking about. What we are seeing in relation to these double standards is not something that is just exclusive about the West. There are a lot of questions saying, what will the United States do? The United States plays a key role in this, but the West does not have a monopoly on double standards. We need to see in 2024, there needs to be an end to the kind of selective outrage that we are seeing, and a more consistent approach. As Rachel was referring to, we have seen what is possible to stop human rights abuses and to protect the civilian population when states choose to actually use all the tools in their toolkit to protect human rights, when they invest in justice and accountability, fact-finding, when they don't use their veto. We've seen what the Human Rights Council can do and other mechanisms within the UN. We've seen what sanctions can deliver. And that needs to happen not just on Ukraine. That needs to happen for all the conflicts that are emerging around the world. And the other danger and why we need to see this specific addressing of double standards is that it is chipping away at the international human rights system. It sends a message that some lives are worth more than others. And that narrative is being seized on by nefarious actors. In particular, we see that China and Russia are using this narrative to tear apart the fragile human rights system and weaken the system because it demands accountability for their own conduct. And lastly, I'd just say that, on top of the double standards, one of the big threats that we saw in 2022 was one of transactional diplomacy. And essentially what that means is where states are prepared to turn a blind eye to domestic human rights issues. Let's take India, for example. We have seen states, including the United States, embrace Modi, literally, physically embrace President Modi on visits, roll out the red carpet, and completely ignore the abuses, including, targeting of ethnic and religious minorities across India, and increased repression against civil society, political opponents, and free press. And they're doing this because they're looking for alternatives for trade from China. And that sort of transactional politics simply, once again, emboldens human rights abusers to do more and to go further, and really perpetuates the cycle.
And comparing 2023 to past years.
I mean, I think we've seen an increase in these patterns. That's one of the things that Human Rights Watch observed most consistently. The double standards became the norm, and transactional diplomacy and sacrificing human rights over short-term political gains was most certainly a very worrying trend that we saw emerge throughout 2023. It didn't come from nowhere, but it's picking up momentum.
Thanks. I'm going to take I'm going to combine two questions from Radio Free Asia. I think Tirana, you can respond to them, but we also may want to bring in our Asia Advocacy Director, John Sifton, who's right over there. Hello, John. One question is from Jenny Tang, who asks, how did China influence global human rights in 2023? And then another interesting question from Tenzin is asking about the challenges for Human Rights Watch in getting information from Tibet, since it's locked and closed to the outside world. And I think maybe we could talk a little bit about how Human Rights Watch works when we have to work remotely and we don't have access to a particular area. This is something we do a lot. So I'll leave this to you, Tirana, and maybe John, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just start and John can pick up. But let's start with the Tibet question first, is that, Human Rights Watch has documented ongoing repression in Tibet. It has been relentless, as it has been for many years now. There has been no let up. How do we document abuses in Tibet? Indeed, China has made it incredibly difficult for decades now for meaningful human rights investigations to take place in Tibet. But we are able to leverage technology. As much as we're talking about the threats to technology, there are some uses. We are able to look at, for example, how the CCP has been redesigning and re-engineering parts of Tibet through the use of satellite imagery, where you can see the building of these sort of new housing where the Chinese Communist Party has been moving non-ethnic Tibetans into Tibet. We are able to obviously use satellite imagery, but also in rare occasions, photographs and videos will emerge from areas where the worst abuses take place. And we have within Human Rights Watch what we call a digital investigations lab, which does a detailed analysis to verify video and photographic evidence, where we can even we can triangulate that with testimony from people who are living in exile outside, or people who are able to escape Tibet and speak to Human Rights Watch. It's all about using technology, satellite imagery, and human eyewitness testimony to triangulate information. And that's how we're able to get credible information out there. In relation to China, I think there have been obviously a number of worrying developments in China. The repression in China continues, but one of the biggest, it's been, whilst the re-education camps appear to, if you look from satellite imagery, some of the re-education camps appear to be closed, there is no evidence that the persecution of Uyghurs has begun to wind down in any sort of way. If anything, what we have documented is that there is increased repression on Muslims across China, including Uyghurs and other ethnic Turkic minorities. And they are being, instead of being put in all of these re-education camps, they're put into the administrative detention and detention facilities, so introduced into the mainstream system. But in many cases, we've spoken to families who have no information about where their loved ones are. And obviously, it's not just about what has been happening inside Xinjiang and inside in Tibet, but also in Hong Kong. Increasingly, we are seeing the chokehold on Hong Kong and Hong Kong activists. And as we mentioned in our report, China has now begun to issue international arrest warrants and even bounties on young Hong Kong activists living abroad. But John, maybe you want to add something.
Yeah, Human Rights Watch has been working on human rights abuses in Tibet for decades and has a number of methodologies which Tirana laid out. But the real challenge here is not to us, to Human Rights Watch, but to Tibetans themselves and to other persecuted ethnic groups such as the Uyghurs, as Tirana laid out, which we found amount to crimes against humanity. But just to clear up, and since we've been working on Tibet and Xinjiang for so long, just want to be clear the day-to-day life that people like Tibetans deal with. They have been subject to mass relocations. Their language has been removed from primary schools. If Tibetans speak out about abuses, They face arrest and persecution, and cash rewards are given for people to inform on others. It's one of the most restrictive places in the world, and it doesn't get enough attention. But the other side of this is, of course, the question about China's role on the UN at the international level, and the things that China does to undermine efforts to seek accountability for what's going on in China, both with Tibet and with Uyghurs. But I think we should probably also discuss, and I think Lou would know even better than I, the way in which China has used its voice and vote at the United Nations and with capitals and governments around the world to undermine efforts to investigate and seek justice for human rights. They've undermined efforts at the UN Human Rights Council to seek justice on North Korea, on Myanmar. They've undermined votes at the UN Security Council using their veto threat. And in more insidious ways, they've sought to strip funding from key UN mechanisms that are set up to investigate and seek accountability for abuses in countries around the world. And they have failed in some of these respects, but they too often succeed. And that's a record that deserves attention as well.
Thanks, John. I can just add that, yes, it's true that we've seen, for those of you who follow UN issues closely, in the Fifth Committee, over the years, we've seen China and Russia in particular working together to try and defund any UN mechanism, body, person, position, job that has the words human rights in it. It is a long-term plan of theirs. As John said, they have not been as successful as they would have liked to have been, but I think their goal is to send a message to the UN system and to the world that they do not see these as legitimate activities of the UN. They try to redefine human rights as development and other things. So this is something that we need to be on our guard about. We've also seen China working closely with Russia, joining it in UN votes on various issues, but not always. Sometimes Russia and China are separate. I have another question here from from Zoom. Eva Peterson from the Norwegian outlet Panorama Nyheter asks if we would agree that labeling government's willingness to condemn war crimes in Gaza, but failure to condemn China's disregard of human rights when it comes to the treatment of Uyghurs, or Russia's war crimes in Ukraine, as examples of the double standards that you're talking about. And do you have specific governments in mind when we're talking about the problem of double standards? And maybe I'll throw in that, do we think that the problem of double standards is something that is particularly the Western governments, Europe and US, or is it a more global issue? Maybe Tirana, you take that, and Rachel, you could come in, and others on the panel, Lama.
Sure. So yes, I mean, what you've highlighted is a textbook example of double standards. It's when we see this selective outrage. And obviously, if we think about the context of what is happening currently and the condemnation against Hamas's abuses, which rightly must be condemned. They are war crimes. But when we look at how governments such as the US and the UK have given full throttled support and have spoken out and condemned the violations that took place in Israel, but have been somewhat muted on the abuses that happened in Gaza. These are the same governments that were, have offered their full throttled, support to accountability mechanisms when it comes to Ukraine, and even, support to ensure accountability and stopping abuses when it comes to the repression and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs that have been taking place in China. But we haven't seen any sort of we haven't seen any steps that have been taken, I mean, not surprisingly from the US, but from the UK, from France, or from other governments who have supported these initiatives about ensuring accountability, for example, of US abuses in Afghanistan. For example. But also, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the West does not have a monopoly on double standards. We have also seen countries like Pakistan, which has spoken out about and condemned what is happening, rightly so, in Gaza. But when it came to actually supporting efforts to protect the Rohingya people in Myanmar, we saw that Pakistan did not step up and actually did not vote for Human Rights Council resolutions in those instances. So, you know, one thing that we would say is these are examples, as you've identified, of double standards, but there is no one state that is responsible for double standards. It is countries all over the world, and the scrutiny that we must apply is to how each and every country shows up to ensure that they are implementing and advocating for human rights and justice and accountability in every context around the world, no matter who the perpetrators are, if they're friends or if they're foes, and no matter who the victims are.
Thanks. Rachel, did you want to come in on that?
Sure, I can just add that the justice response to war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine was completely unprecedented and very welcome. And I think just two things. First, I think it's important to look a little closer at what that response, what that international response was, because it can provide it's a positive example. It shows what can be done, and you know, countries that are not that are withholding from you know, endorsing ICC investigations in other places like in Gaza. I mean, they need to look at the whole panoply of justice measures that are available and that can be used. And so in Ukraine, in Ukraine, there was the, you know, the endorsement or the, you know, the support for the ICC's investigation that's been open. It's been quite active, and the ICC has an office now. The Office of the Prosecutor has an office now in Ukraine. There was the Putin arrest warrant, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, which is a landmark step. There are other justice measures. There's been European and US support for the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, which now has like 100,000 cases open on potential violations. There's been new rules the European Union has developed new rules that allow it to create a database, you know, a database and share its data with the Ukrainian prosecutor's office in order to better, you know, archive and systematize documentation and evidence and to preserve evidence. There's also the UN, you know, as I mentioned, the UN Commission of Inquiry that was created pursuant to the Human Rights Council resolution. So there's a whole range of measures, of justice response measures that are welcome, that are necessary, because justice is going to it takes a long time, and we need to lay this groundwork now. And it shows what can be done when there is real, when there's determination and when there's a commitment to justice. And this needs to be not just for Ukraine, but Ukraine should be showing the way.
Thanks. So first you, and then Ibtizam.
Thank you. Alan Bulkati from RIA Novosti News Agency. I have a question to Madam Denber, please, if I may. I've taken a look at the part which is regarding the Ukraine in the report, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't found any mentioning of the crackdown on the Ukrainian church, Orthodox Church. Could you please explain why there are no mentioning, if I'm right?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards to talk about the, you know, developments domestically inside Ukraine. We haven't been working on the issue of what's going on with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I know that there have been There have been developments on that because of allegations that the Orthodox Church is, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is quite tightly connected to the Moscow Patriarchate, but that's really all I can say for now. There are other issues that that I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards on Ukraine and domestic developments if you'd like.
Ibtizam?
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have several points. I want to go back to the issue of double standards, but to connect it to the UN and the SG. And whether you think that he's doing what he needs to do in this case. If we, for example, take the issue of children in armed conflict and him not listing powerful governments or supported by like Israel and other government on that list, what is your message to him? And do you want him to see him do more or be speak more on that? And on Gaza, I want to ask also, how worried are you that the amount of bombing that we are seeing, the amount of human rights violations is going to set a new precedent, if we can call it like this, to or give protection to like a green light to other governments in the futures, in other conflict, that they can do whatever they want if they are supported by powerful countries. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Let's start with the list of shame, because this is where violators of children's rights are listed by the Secretary General and put on a list which is presented to the Security Council under Resolution 1612. Absolutely, 100%. We believe that both Israel and Palestinian armed groups should be listed on the list of shame. These sort of tools for accountability when it comes to children's rights and abuses against children in armed conflict, they depend on consistency. You cannot get off the list if you are friends with the Secretary General, or if that you are funding a humanitarian operation. And we have seen that instance before too, in relation to Yemen and Saudi Arabia in the past. So, we have seen that the tools like the public listing of perpetrators of children's rights in armed conflict is fragile, and it will be undermined if there's not a consistent approach. So Human Rights Watch has communicated to the Secretary General the importance of ensuring that Israel and Palestinian armed groups are listed in the next listing when that goes to the Security Council. In relation to the bombings, and are we concerned that this is not just the bombings, but maybe let's just say violations of international humanitarian law, of the laws of war? Are we concerned that, what we are seeing now, the escalation, what looks like a proliferation of armed conflicts and violations of IHL around the world will give a green light? Yes, that is a risk. It's a real risk. And the only way that we can ensure that the message is sent that human rights violations, the killing of civilians, the killing of children, the targeting of hospitals, the killing of humanitarian workers, the killing of journalists in armed conflicts, the only way that this is going to stop is if there is accountability for those crimes. And that takes will from states, but it's not a political decision. Remember that human rights law and international humanitarian law are not a nice to have. These are laws and standards which essentially create the guardrails to our common humanity. And we cannot have carve-outs and exceptions. All governments have to be held to the same standard. Not every case has to end up in the International Criminal Court. That is not the only pathway. Immediate action can be taken that sends a message to human rights abusers during armed conflict that their conduct is in violation of international law and must stop. There are targeted sanctions, there are travel bans, and these need to apply not just in, and I've said this before, the conflicts that are hitting the headlines. This needs to apply in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This needs to apply in the conflicts that we hear nothing about. And I think I'm going to come back to Ukraine, because if you want to look for a good example of how you send the message that the cost of human rights abuses and the costs of war crimes is going to be high, look to Ukraine. That everything that was mobilized by the international community and states in Ukraine were all of the tools in the international diplomatic and international law toolkit. And if it could be done for Ukraine, that's got to be the high standard, and that's what we need to see in relation to all other contexts.
Thanks, Tirana. And maybe Carine, if you want to talk about African situations.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick, I think, thought on the double standards. As Tirana said, the West does not have the monopoly. And I would like us to just go back a little bit and focus on the African region, where we've had unprecedented leadership, not just from South Africa, but from another country before, Gambia, when the Gambia introduced a case before the same International Court of Justice against Myanmar. Now, you remember the formidable speech that the Kenyan permanent representative at the time made when Russia invaded Ukraine. We would like to see the same. African citizens, activists, the civil society, the journalists would like to see an environment created by the same African leaders and in which double standards should not be allowed. But for them not to be allowed, African leaders have to exert the same level of leadership that they have in reaching out to world institutions for their own people. And I think to your question, what are we seeing in terms of trends and patterns? Those are the trends that are needed in order to have more stability and a more protection of human rights. Thanks.
Thanks. Question from the floor.
Yes, thank you for briefing. So my name is Yuya from Kyodo News, Japanese media. So my question is about Japan. So Tirana, so could you give me a little bit more comment about the situation of Japan?
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that we've seen with Japan is that it could play a much more important role on the international stage when it comes to being an important human rights leader, particularly in the Asia region. You know, Japan has relationships, for example, with Myanmar and economic interests, and it could exercise its influence over Myanmar when it comes to actually stopping violations of international law and human rights abuses in Myanmar. So we would like to see Japan take a more proactive role on the international stage. There has been a commitment, actually, a public commitment by Japan to say that it would take human rights would be part of its foreign policy, but we are yet to really see that in action. So I think that's one very important thing. I think the other thing that we note about Japan has been on a hopeful note, which is that the court has now introduced, legislation that it protects the rights of LGBT people in Japan against discrimination. And that was a hard-won fight. For years, civil society and LGBT activists have been lobbying the Japanese government. And I think it shows what is possible with the persistence and the importance of creating vibrant civil society that is able to advocate for the rights of groups who have traditionally been marginalized. But John, I don't know if you want to add anything on Japan.
Yeah, so as we lay out in the World Report chapter, there have been a number of developments beyond the LGBT example. That was reforms to the criminal justice law to broaden the definition of rape, which was far too restrictive. And but we've also written reports in the last year focusing on serious procedural problems with the criminal justice system of Japan, its hostage justice methodologies, as well as the continuing use of the death penalty, which, like with the United States, makes Japan an outlier in the G7 and in a lot of advanced economies. On the international level, just to buttress what Tirana said, Human Rights Watch has been engaged in Tokyo, in our Tokyo office, in a decade plus effort to get Japan to act like the number 3, number 4 economy that it is on the world stage and promote human rights, not just in word, but in deed. And very, very slowly, both the Diet and successive prime ministers have started to tilt towards making human rights part of Japanese foreign policy, but not enough action. They still fail to co-sponsor key resolutions, championing justice, and they continue to have economic relations with very problematic regimes, in particular, not just Myanmar, but Vietnam, Cambodia, very deep diplomatic and economic ties. So Japan has a lot of soul searching to do. If it really wants to get real about making human rights part of its foreign policy, it needs to act and not just speak.
Thanks, John. I have another question from Zoom, and then we may close it. Oh, okay, we have a bit more here. So this is from Edward Giraudet. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name out there. From Global Insights, he asks, and this is, I think, a question that everyone up here might want to say a quick word about. For accountability, what about governments which do not recognize or have not ratified the ICC, the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court? Also, aren't Israel and Russia involved in more than just alleged genocide? What about other aspects of the Geneva Conventions, which are so often ignored? Tirana, you want to kick that off?
Sure. I mean, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, is that the International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute is not the only pathway to justice. You know, in many situations where we see serious violations of human rights, even violations of the laws of war, there are multiple other ways that we can see justice and accountability through formal proceedings. There's, you know, clearly there's courts in some of these countries. There are functioning courts where domestic courts are able to hear and try and collect evidence in relation to human rights abuses and violations that take place. But also there's a very important tool that is emerging as a very powerful method of delivering justice and accountability for victims, and it's referred to as universal jurisdiction. And universal jurisdiction essentially means that you can prosecute some of the most serious crimes that take place somewhere else in a local jurisdiction. And I actually am going to pass to Lama, because there is an excellent example of universal jurisdiction being used, for example, where the International Criminal Court has fallen short, like in contexts like Syria. Universal jurisdiction was used there, and I think maybe Lama, if you want to say a word on that.
Thanks, Tirana. I mean, before there was Gaza, there was Syria, and there was more than a decade of abuse that, in many cases, played out in real time. And we saw the hopes of activists, of citizen journalists, to literally risk their lives to document abuse dashed when it looked like justice was going to be out of reach, because the ICC did not have jurisdiction in Syria. But using principles of universal jurisdiction, we did see that some countries in Europe began conducting investigations, compiling evidence, using evidence also that was collected by a UN General Assembly fact-finding mechanism, the IIIM. And we saw some of the first prosecutions now take place in Germany against those responsible for torture. This is systemic torture that took place during the war in Syria, which continues until today. And it does send an important message that even if it can take many years, it can take a decade, that there are consequences to perpetration of war crimes on this scale. And I am encouraged that there are, further states that are looking to expand resources for war crimes prosecutions in their countries, for events that take place, far from their borders.
Yeah, I can just also add on, just on 2 points, the point about your universal jurisdiction and also the question about other aspects of the Geneva Conventions that for which Russia is responsible for violating in Ukraine. And so on universal jurisdiction, actually a number of European states have opened investigations under principles of universal jurisdiction. This include, Germany, France, some of the Baltic countries as well. And in addition to these, what are called, sort of structural investigations, whether it's an information gathering stage, there, just last month, there have been individual cases filed under the principle of universal jurisdiction in Germany by people who from Ukraine who are victims of Russian violations in Ukraine. And there are also, I believe, at least seven cases in France also under universal jurisdiction, but these are all French citizens. People have French citizens or French residency status who were alleging violations by Russia against them in Ukraine. And then also on the point about the Geneva Conventions, yes, I mean, there are Russia is responsible for violating a wide range of the Geneva Conventions in Ukraine. But this is not just about allegations of genocide. We've documented a litany of violations by Russian forces, whether it's, as I mentioned during my opening remarks, indiscriminate, disproportionate bombing and shelling, whether it's which has caused thousands of untold numbers actually of civilian deaths, injuries, destruction of infrastructure, and the like. And it's the torture and unlawful detention, forced displacement of civilians in areas that Ukraine that Russia is occupying in Ukraine, and it's also the forced transfer of civilians who they continue to detain in occupied areas, and then they forcibly transfer them to the Russian Federation and put them in prison there. So it's a wide range of violations of the Geneva Conventions, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the like.
Okay, so we're going to do two last questions over there and then close it down. Or do you want you have one? Let's take them all together. Yeah, and then we're going to close it off.
Thank you, Stefano Vaccaro, La Voce di New York. What is your assessment about the recent report from UN Watch on UNRWA and the accusation that actually he's promote terrorism and anti-Semitism and so on? Okay, Evelyn, you can't pass the.
Well, good to see you, Lou, and we did. Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter Media and past Lou, and 100 years at covering the UN. But anyway, there's an election, as we all know, in the United States this year. If any of the Republican candidates that we know win, what's the impact on human rights abroad as well as here? Or does it really not make any difference?
Thanks. And yep, take the mic. Ask Chris. Here.
My name is Sinan. I'm with Rudal Media Network. My question is, what's the current human rights situation in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and especially for Kurds? And according to, if you compare 22 and 2023. Thank you.
Okay, for that last question, we probably need a whole 2 hours. But let's quickly run through those things. Tirana, do you want to?
I'll maybe just jump around a little bit, but I'll start and I'm going to pass to Lama. On the accusations that have been made against UNRWA, Human Rights Watch has no evidence to give credibility to those claims. And like what we have been advocating for is that there is full, unfettered humanitarian access to civilians in Gaza. And what we do know is UNRWA has been an important UN humanitarian agency that has been delivering that sort of assistance. UNRWA schools, for example, and warehouses are protected under international humanitarian law. They are humanitarian spaces. It is where civilians that have been displaced in Gaza have been taking shelter. And there have been obviously multiple reports that these have actually been hit during the fight and during the fighting, and there have been the loss of civilian lives. And so from Human Rights Watch's position, we can't answer any claims specifically against UNRWA, but we do advocate strongly and forcefully for the protection of all humanitarian organizations that are operating in the Gaza Strip, and that there should be full unfettered access, including the opening of the borders, so that life-saving humanitarian assistance can get into Gaza, and that those humanitarian spaces are protected and respected in accordance with international law. Lama, do you want to add, and maybe you can take the very short question.
Yes, thank you, Tirana. For the questions. I just want to add to what Tirana has said about UNRWA and the allegations against UNRWA. I think, we do not have any suggestion that those allegations are founded. But what we do know is that there has been interference with the delivery of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian operations in Gaza, and that it has had catastrophic effects on the civilian population. UNRWA sites are protected sites. These are areas where civilians are living in conditions of displacement, which are incredibly crowded, are unsanitary. This is the last hope of survival for many people, is going to these shelters. And UNRWA staff and facilities do have protection from attacks. In terms of the question related to Syria and Iraq, in the situation in Syria, despite the fact that it has fallen out of the headlines, continues to be dire. We do see that there are ongoing strikes in Idlib by Syrian government and Russian forces that have resulted in civilian casualties. Some of these strikes have used prohibited weapons, cluster munitions, and the legacy of impunity for crimes that have been perpetrated over the course of the war, continue to have an impact on the ground. We continue to see that there are arbitrary detentions, that there is torture in detention, and this has only been exacerbated by the severe economic situation in the country, where people are struggling to make ends meet, to really be able to subsist. In terms of the Kurdish areas, in particular, we do know that there are some areas in northern Syria that have also been occupied by Turkey. We will have actually a forthcoming report on the situation, which goes into it in some depth, and happy to share that with you. But what is clear is that there are ongoing abuses by groups supported by Turkey in northern Syria, and this has resulted in displacement of the population. It has resulted in attacks on civilians. In Iraq, Iraq has enjoyed a level of stability in 2023 that was not characteristic of the years preceding. But we do continue to see some very egregious rights abuses, and that there has been a failure to provide compensation, for example, for protesters that were injured in protests in 2019. There continues to be issues related to enforced disappearance and arbitrary detentions, and restrictions on freedom of expression that have resulted really in a chilling effect on civil society. And these issues, unfortunately, are not limited to the central government of Iraq, but also the president and the KRG.
Thanks. And then the last question about the impact of there's US election, and there are more than 60 elections around the world. Tirana, you want to close off the press conference?
Sure. Human Rights Watch doesn't take positions on elections, but I think that what we have learned from US elections in the past and the conduct of various administrations is it doesn't matter who's elected. All leaders need to be held to account. The US occupies a very important role in the international order and has a very powerful, has a significant influence, is very powerful. So we are concerned about an environment where human rights abuses are permitted and enabled, both domestically in the United States, but because actually there is enormous work to be done in this country about racial justice, poverty, mental health, migration, access to healthcare. The list is long. So whoever is in the White House must prioritize human rights. And that includes the US's conduct abroad, whether that be in conflict, or how US foreign policy plays out, whether that be here at the United Nations or abroad. Human rights should be central to US's foreign policy. Maybe if we're wrapping up, Lou, one of the things that we saw this year is that we've talked a lot about double standards. We've talked a lot about transactional diplomacy, but I want to talk about what is possible. And, one of the things that we have identified through 2022 is there's a pattern that emerges. We call them the canaries in the coal mine for human rights and potential autocracy. When you start seeing, we see consistently in every single region, as human rights start backsliding, we see attacks on minorities, attacks on refugees, attacks on migrants, attacks on women and women's reproductive health. We see attacks on the LGBT community. And if those are allowed to persist, then they evolve into the next level, which is attacks on institutions. It's attacks on the judiciary. It's attacks on free press, freedom of assembly, civil society. So we should not accept from leaders around the world that it's okay to sit back and watch the backsliding and then be outraged and surprised when catastrophe hits. There are things that governments can do in real time and early, holding trade partners to account, ensuring that states are protecting civil society space and free and democratic societies is possible. But it takes action, not only action from inside nation states, but it takes actions from the partners, whether they be trade or security partners, or the member states who make up this institution and other institutions, which are key to ensuring accountability and the realization of human rights. One question that has come up, and it hasn't come up from you today, but keeps coming up, is like, well, what are the bright spots? And we've talked a little bit about them. We're moving towards marriage equality in places like Nepal. There are lots of individual examples, but I'll tell you what should give us hope and why we can't give up. And it's women and girls in Afghanistan. Afghanistan may have been the most devastating country to live in as a woman and a young girl than anywhere in the world. And we have seen attacks on education. We have seen restrictions on where they can move outside in society, restrictions on if women being able to work. And even though the Taliban is trying to erase women from the landscape of Afghan society, we saw women and girls take to the streets. We see alternative ways for women and girls to find education. And if those women and girls are prepared to take to the streets and risk being arrested by the Taliban, then world leaders and everybody in this room can't afford to give up and throw our hands up in the air and say human rights don't matter. If the people at the center whose human rights are being abused are still prepared to fight, then human rights matter. And I think that that is the charge of 2024. This is not a time to throw our hands up in the air. I think if anything, what we saw last year should be a call to action. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And you can read our world report online, hrw.org. The whole thing is there. We didn't print it out this year because we believe in protecting the environment. So thanks again for coming. It was a pleasure to be here.
I need to know that.